Good morning, everyone. Once again, we are back to understand with the topic this time for Gate Architecture 2025. That's historical and modern examples of urban design. Okay. Now, to start with, first we have to, in brief manner, know what is urban design. As we all know that it's not only science, but it also involves art. And concisely, urban design is the art and science of shaping our cities. Of course, the area to be dealt is quite huge, and since it's a scale of the city, so that's the word which urban justifies it to explain, not only to shape it in an artistic manner, but not to leave the science behind it. We have to understand that art and science, they actually go hand in hand to establish a perfect city or a habitable sustenance. Now, from the grand plans of ancient civilizations, and when we approach this century, when we are talking about it, the design has evolved alongside humanity. Now, why do we say humanity? Is obviously our upfront immediate requirement is to satisfy the ones who are the direct users, and that humanity word is not only included to humans. We will be actually dealing with lots of living potentials, which may be humans or any other form of living beings. Okay, so let's get deep into it. Now, to understand from where it started, we have three keynotes. Of course, Greece, Rome, and the cities which stem out into the medieval era. To understand it from the point of view of Greek development, when we say that something has developed strongly, we cannot forget that we have to talk about Athens. It was concentrated purely on a central design which aims at a complete wider spectrum, huge circumference, spreading it out, but from the core focus of center, which is actually the agora. Or in short, I would say, when we are talking of Greece, we are not talking of agora. That is not possible. It was definitely the most happening event of having a public space for trade, gathering, and political discourse. So that means all the three corners of the basic triangle which develops the infrastructure of a city shape were all in place: trade, gathering, and political discourse. Of course, this pattern of designing, when we were talking the realm of agora, the prioritization deals with the public realm and of course a very strong sense of community. That means community development shaped itself into a concentric or a center focused development. When we come down to Rome, these were completely different. If we are talking of agora here, we have to understand that we are talking of grid system when we are talking of Rome. This resulted definitely not into a very efficient transportation, but of course the resource was managed very cleanly. When we are talking of a grid, we are obviously talking moreover a 90-degree confront. We have to move straight or we have to turn at 90 degree, and the movement is again straight. So in short, if we can say that out of the Greece and the Romans, the huge difference is that from those circles and the random, or I would say organic or a circular behavior, things slightly turned into a very systematic or a properly managed grid factor to be carrying the entire skeleton. Okay. Of course, we saw huge introduction of not only roads, aqueducts, and public spaces which were purely strategically planned. It was not that where you get a space, maybe say out of the grid, if this is empty, I would take it out. No. The plan will work up every corner of even a open space or a public space broadly. The core happening of this was, of course, not only a very well planned architectural grid, I would say, but of course, because of the growing empire or the dynasties grew which way, is establishing a very defined format of a public space. Now, progressing from the Greece to the Romans, when we entered into the medieval cities, they were purely, again, I don't say going back to Greece, but of course following strict lines of trade and commerce at their first on the list. Now, this was basically worked in a very, very calculated manner. The medieval cities saw that they typically characterized a very, very densely packed building structure. Emphasis was more on the packing or the demographic density towards the building rather than the streets. We see here that the streets remained quite narrow, and of course they were hugely surrounding a very, very huge central market square. Next, when we have to talk of great urban development, we have to always understand that Babylon cannot be left. It is not only a great city of wonders, it is beautifully known for its strategic planning. Of course, wonders is more towards the aesthetic appeal, but it never left the strategy of planning, satisfying the aesthetics, as you can, with the most common example, see for the Ishar gate. And this existence of formal gates definitely has been a very, very important part during the aesthetic sense of entire development of Babylon. Apart from, it is hugely known and remembered for the hanging gardens and the ziggurat at Marduk. Now, when we talk of great structures, we have to always understand that it is not only one, they could be many when we are talking during the course of urban ancient development. If I confront on the strategic planning, it deals with huge areas of planning meticulously dealt, reflecting two major facts. One is towards the political essence and other is towards the religious significance. Now, when I say religious, it talks of more towards the temples, and when I say towards the political, we talk more of walls and palaces which were greatly done and very, very strategically arranged. It promptly highlighted basically to project upon huge power and control. So when we are talking of Babylon, 3 points to conclude: a city of wonders, that means aesthetics was very important. Core identifications were hanging gardens, ziggurat and gates. The strategic planning aspects, they deal with the political and the religious note, which talk about the walls and the temples more. And then it is the urban infrastructure which takes huge possession for the Babylons. Why? Because this definitely not only included the planning and the aesthetics, it also took huge care towards things which were the inner skeletons, like the irrigation systems, the sanitation facilities, the paved roads, which demonstrated huge aspects of urban planning at that time, which we even these days feel are obviously quite complex and huge to discuss, but to have something at that era and that too so strategically was of course something which has been always a medium to study and get to know more. Next on the list is the Haussmann's renovation of Paris. Now this turned the entire thought process during the ancient course of urban development, because something like this was extremely huge to be not only imagined but to get re-established was a changing, or I would say a 360-degree turn into the era of infrastructural development for the course of not only a city but with the entire skeleton to be changing. Now, when you think of renovation, if it is to the scale of a house or a street or a park or a defined area which can be drawing some limits, it is still easier. But when we are talking of something which is of the cityscape, we can understand how huge are the complexities. So this was divided into 4 major areas, and this considered itself to deal with, as I say, 4 corners. One, to have grand boulevards. Second, to extremely work on the improvisation of sanitation. Third was an intact or an encompassing urban renewal. And fourth was the controversial legacy. Now, how do we deal with these 4? If we talk of a multiple choice question and we are asked upon any of the 5th point which is not a part of this, it could always be saying out like, which of them is not a part of Haussmann's renovation of Paris, and say I answer it this way. 1, to deal with grand boulevards to be re-established. Second, to deal with improved sanitation. Third, to deal with urban renewal. Fourth, to deal with controversial legacy. And 5, to deal with sustainable ecosystem. So the answer would now become sustainable ecosystem, because that was not a part and parcel of this entire renovation process. Now, if I go into depth of each one of them, I've cornered primarily 3 points each so that you can summarize and understand that how does this skeleton go about renovating the entire city content. The first idea was to completely start with creating a wide boulevard, and which will not only work as a boulevard in itself to be getting into a infrastructural aid, but it will also automatically improve the traffic flow. Of course, throughout its essence of development, you will have a very huge transformed city aesthetic. You can see the reference for an example here. When we are talking of a boulevard, the entire transformation, not only from the aerial perspective, but standing within it also enhances the skyline surrounding you. Second was improved sanitation. The core crux was to develop new sewer systems entirely with the water facilities in the matter of infrastructure. Second, not directly related for a sanitation conduct, but of course it addresses to the public health concerns. So by and large, you are forming the same loop if you are providing new good sewer systems and water infrastructure. You are directly talking towards addressing an important fact of concerns of health overall for the public, not on individual basis. And third was to enhance the entire city's livability. Now here we can say that we are talking this hand in hand when we are talking of a central boulevard along with the city's livability, that the entire oxygen of the space has to be good. The prime workers were the first two. Third was a wider area, not point to point to be worked one by one on the sheet, but of course it involved a huge number of steps, because the basic one was to demolish the existing neighborhoods. Now this is a huge task, but it was one of the most prompt suggestions to go for a urban renewal, that first we have to demolish the existing neighborhoods. In our terms, we may say it was a sort of deconstructivism. Second is to replace them with grand avenues and public squares and new buildings. Now here we have to note, we are talking of demolition of a neighborhood. That means we are more towards the ground, and we are talking of G or G+1 community. But when we are coming with a solution, we are talking more towards the grand avenues. That means huge open areas, huge public squares. So into already a demographically medium to high neighborhood being replaced with an open space and a public square, then how do you deal this with the same density to be establishing is the new buildings, which of course have to be created with the modern efficiency. And of course it indirectly gave that rise of the vertical development for the residential settlement. Last is a very controversial legacy, which you may say Paris definitely follows it, but it has a habit of having its aesthetic achievements. We know Paris has many examples for this. I don't feel it is very important at this level to quote those examples. They have been quite famous, and many of them to be listed. Still, those who want to go about these achievements of aesthetic purpose for the segment of Paris, they can view our next lecture, which is going to be purely on the building milestones or aesthetic achievements on city basis. Of course, this, coming to the second point, caused a result of displacement of lot of social inequalities. This you can directly relate what we talked in the previous point. When we are removing the neighborhoods and when we are coming with public spaces along with structures which are going to be higher, so obviously this displacement is going to cause a lot of social inequality. The ones who are from the mid to low segment, they are going to walk towards the outer, and the ones who are going to be obviously from the mid to higher segment, they are going to be established more towards the city squares and the boulevards. Third is highlighting the complex social implication of urban renewal. Now here we are talking of something which was a futuristic connector. That means if I say the statement that Haussmann's renovation of Paris is a futuristic connector, the statement would fall in the category of true. Okay. Now, next in the count, we will discuss the acute points of the radiant city. Now, do we know which is the radiant city by a city name, or it is a concept? So we have to rightly understand. The very well concept line is, when we talk of Le Corbusier's radiant city, is to propose a radical departure from traditional urban planning. That means it may be 1, it may be 2, it may be 3. When a city is establishing itself and leaving from the typical traditional urban planning, and it is moving towards the high rise or the green spaces hand in hand with efficient transportation systems. That was the modernist vision of saying something to be a radiant city. If I relate it in the current context, you may say it is as good as the way we talk that is the city a smart city or not. So it has some standard specifications that what is a smart city. Likewise, when we are talking of a radiant city, there are three corners again: high rise, green spaces, and a very efficient transportation system. Because when we are talking of high rise, we are not only talking of the spatial transportation horizontally, we are supposed to be equally concerned for the vertical transportation. That also has to be equally comfortable and working. Second point was functionalism. What is the skeleton of functionalism of a radiant city? Where did it prioritize? First, function. Second, efficiency. That means, moreover, it was more towards the performance of the building or the city and not only talking to start with the aesthetics to build it, right? So here obviously we slightly entered into a silent zone of maximizing the space, because everything needed the function to be defined first and minimizing the waste with a very clear focus on geometric forms. So you will see that when we start to enter into this era of radiant cities and primarily conceptualized by Le Corbusier, we were turning the entire geometry from that huge, mega, curvical, just beautiful structures towards the maximizations of space, minimizations of the waste areas, and clear focus on pure geometric forms to elevate this requirement. Okay, what does social utopia mean here? I'm sure you all might have heard this word, which is social utopia, and Le Corbusier's vision aimed very clear at that. It was completely to create a equitable, sustainable environment. Now, what does this equitable word mean here? We have to understand this is a very good mathematical equation to understand. If I say equitable, sustainable urban environment, I simply say what I input, that has to be the output at least. That means, in a common understanding, if I am consuming some energy, some space, some time, some resource, I am supposed to exclude out also equally some energy, some time, conservance, and some support system so that my ecosystem remains balanced. In short, it should be like you are not supposed to only and only keep taking from the environment. You have to also give back to the environment. I hope I'm clear with the social utopia. It is purely an equalization of a sustainable urban environment. Second, the separation of functions. That means if it is work, it is work. If it is leisure, it is leisure. This will automatically land up not only a correct utilization of space, but to an extent a clean transportation or a management of a very clean transportation system. Okay. Now, while this radiant city had a very strong impact on the modernist urban planning, we should understand, but it was hugely criticized also, because this somewhere definitely separated the ways of settlement, but that blend of the social cohesion was lost. Why? Because somewhere that tying knot was completely divided with transportation systems and areas of function. Complete separation of this social integration started to be into observance, and the idea actually of this radiant city plan was basically involving rebuilding the cities completely using the modern method. It was centering around large prefabricated apartment buildings and with less units that would house thousands of residents, of course, but since the function and the strata of function was so huge to be just managing the transportation and the infrastructure, that integration of an unsaid social behavior slightly started to decrease. Still, when we are learning about something as a matter of a theory or a concept, we ought to know what are the basic principles. Some of them, if have been criticized, you will always see that the supplements or the next followers, they try to improve it and get on to the next stage. Okay. Now, when we shift from this major examples of the ancient study, let us now come to the modernist urban planning, and we may start to talk towards the 20th century. Here things were simple because they were disintegrated again into small corners, or I may say multiple centers. Following the international style, now for us, what is international? For you, what is international? The definitions will change as you change your geographical location. But this blend started to get in. The rule books of that it is completely Greek or completely Roman or completely medieval or completely Gothic. These trends started to break when we walked into the 20th century, because now these became the icons of, like, we in Asian context may have something which purely resembles a Greek era or architecture for a palatial or even a personal villa development. So that means a mixing of an international style on a choice base or a pickup bag basis, that I go to a shop and if I like a leather purse, I may purchase it. I may like a clothing or a linen. So the same way, when I started to create for ourselves maybe a small unit or maybe a city development, something started to blend internationally. Things were picked up, what were good, what were appreciated, what were workable, and what were liked. And then they started to blend. This emergence was quite seen, fragrant into the 20s and the 30s. The new town development, which took place after the World War II, this concept of new town was very strongly developed, because of course the reason was quite understandable because of the destructions after the World War II. But of course, when it started to happen, it was addressing primarily only to address the housing shortages, and that started to create more livable urban environments. Now when I say urban environments, we obviously mean that we are talking of a scale which is going to be huge, but the word environment will always tie that you will have open spaces and you will have a lot of ecological sustenance along with it, which traveled to some time, but then closely we see that the urban had a lift and the environment had a drift in the opposite direction. Still, during its early course of development, it was emphasized with a lot of green spaces, community facilities, and a very efficient transportation system. And we will realize that even towards the 20s and the 30s of the 1900 count, the following of the Radiant City by Lee Corbusier was still into existence. Apart from this, when we landed towards this 20th century, one thing more happened very strongly, which is not quite apparently defined into town planning, you may say, or urban planning, but this development of a car-centric city started to see its existence, which maybe into hugely dense cities, we may say, has become now something called a parking problem, if not dealt properly. So when we are talking of a car-centric city, I am not saying that you are going to have completely huge parking, but the word deals in a better manner to proper development of a car-centric city to result into sprawling suburbs. That means to strain out the load from the core center, freeway systems, and to decline the public transit was a acute observation. Everybody from one node to other node would travel down. The medium becomes car, and of course when it becomes car, so there has to be a parking zone here and here, and the mobility also acutely caused the development of again a very dense and a closed network. So to an extent we may say that this entire development, one of the key contributor is going to be this vehicle enhancement, which suddenly saw that the strength or the way the urban cities developed was completely changed. Here we come back to the point again, which was the urban renewal. Why? Because it matches with the concept that you need to demolish the neighborhoods to find out space. Within the same community, if I have so much of space, I will not be able to deal the car-centric behavior. If I have to get into this purely towards the new towns, I have to come back to the renewal with the concept of demolishing the neighborhoods and getting on more towards the vertical rise of the cities. Now, speaking to this, Jane Jacobs has put quite a lot of work and known for one of the critic of the modernist design, that when we were facing this change, how was this actually dealt, written in the form of a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. It deals broadly with four main areas. I would again emphasize here, if you are answering a multiple choice question, the question may ask you something like this: which of the following is not an inclusion in the critical analysis of modernist design by Jane Jacobs? So if it's human scale, neighborhood diversity, importance of streets, and death and life of great American cities, we will have to understand, suppose if we are talking of non-existence of an energy efficient system, that is the point. We have to note it both ways, which is included, if out of these any one is included, or which of them is not the point of analytical criticism, then we should be knowing the point. The idea is very, very simple to understand. It was Jacob who argued very strongly that the modernist planning disregarded the importance of human scale, and which is a common upfront of the radiant city, that the social analogy actually got diminished. So this demolition of the social integrity was the point which is referred to as a human scale disintegration, and was criticized quite as a part and parcel of the modernist designs. Okay, now this happened basically why? Because the separation of functions and prioritization of cars over the pedestrians. That means two corners of the radiant city. One is the separation of function and the leisure space, and then inclusion of more vehicular movement. These two caused this human interaction completely coming down to a very, very low lying graph. Next is the neighborhood diversity. When we started to demolish and when we advocated for this neighborhood to go towards the buildings, obviously the confront of man to man or interaction from neighbor to neighbor, this slowed down, because then everything was diversified from your vertical buildings standing on here and all of them traveling, waiting to go to a central place and meet there. What happens in the neighborhood is that you just step out of your door and you can just have at least a smiling face around you. This neighborhood diversity caused this social interaction to almost get demolished because of the modernist urban city criteria, which followed the radiant city concept. Importance of streets, of course. How did the streets play their role? Initially, when we see for the pedestrians and the neighborhood planning, we would always have a street which has to confront multiple parameters, and not only talking of streets to be working on for fast moving cars. So by and large, we will see that the prime function or fascia was actually to understand that this modernist rule book of course catered to many good points, but the core where a establishment talks for a humanity, that slightly slowed down, and it got stored somewhere at a corner, which moved to the external periphery now. The death and life of great American cities. This was basically the point which touches that why this book was written by her. She actually challenged, basically by writing this book, the concept of the modernist urban planning, and argued that it was actually supposed to be more a human-centered approach rather than a car-centered or a building-centered approach. But the facts are that because of the demography and the density, we are forced to move to this, even knowing this. Our point is not to criticize or to understand right now. Our point is who included what. You should be able to answer that in a multiple choice question if you are asked an exam. So the concepts of each one of them have to be very clear. We have taken from the ancients, the Greece, the Romans, the medieval, then the entrance of the Haussmanns for the Paris complete renovation, the radiant city concept, and a criticism of Jane Jacob about the modernist concept. Okay, now let us come slightly towards the positive side of how this urbanism actually broke down with three different eras again. The baby of urbanism is actually the new urbanism. When we started to know that what is urbanism, it ethically promotes sustainable and walking communities. Precisely. The urbanist neighborhoods are basically to design, of course, not with the criteria, the way the old cities developed, lot of open spaces and lot of groundwork. Of course, now the ground plots have been taken care by the huge ones, the vertical structures, but still maintaining quite a lot of good open space with a variety of housing and jobs. You also have quite a good variety of open space, and the core target at initial level of urbanism. That is why I say that new urbanism was the time when we are talking, it's the baby, the initial infant stage of urbanism. And it was believed that these strategies will also reduce traffic time, because if you have good walkable area or a controlled urban sprawling area, you would avoid the vehicle. But as we progressed and we moved towards the sustainable urbanism, this actually turned the picture. They continued to erect upon the building upfront, the infrastructure upfront, but the target was to reduce the carbon footprint. So that means the development was not compromised. What was compromised was that please reduce on the carbon footprint. We don't say that don't develop, but develop it with as much as possible a reduced carbon footprint. So this reduction of carbon footprint and this terminology of carbon footprint started to come when we started to move towards the sustainable urbanism. Prime focus was, of course, still green infrastructure with renewable energies, and the best of examples with us are Oslo and Singapore, one of the renowned cities to be existing as sustainable urbanism. Oslo also enjoys its existence into the category of smart city. So it is one of the cities who has two feathers in their cap, it being a sustainable city and of course a smart city. When we talk towards smart city, we don't say that we reduce on the sustenance, but of course the technology sees itself at a next level. The cities are usually to improvise on efficiency of sustainability and livability, but of course with everything into a smart traffic management, data driven public safety and integrated transportation systems. London and Zurich with Geneva also fall into this same category. Even Australia is into the same category. That's not mentioned in the slide, but you should know that smart cities also has Australia into this count. Last but not the least, we should kindly know that what are the highline parks in the New York City. Why? Because this is one of the good parameters of getting into a category of smart city. This takes care of revitalizing the spaces. What we may leave, they have been utilized. The Highline Park is a public park which is built on an elevated former freight rail. It is in Manhattan, New York City. So things which you actually just leave about, even they have been taken to vitalize a space available. Innovations and designs are the most transformed area, with having huge industrial spaces into a vibrant public amenity. Because when we are talking of industrial area, normally such areas with us are also left, that since it's an industrial area or a vicinity, you may not be allowed to move with that proximity. But they have worked upon even the industrial area with their huge spaces what have been there. They have been utilized for vibrant public amenity. So let the industry do their job, but because of the industry being there, the quantum of open spaces which they have to deal, that has been converted into public amenities. Last is the community hub. Now this is something very efficiently done, and that is why everybody just wants to go to New York once. The community movement has been equally taken care along with the high rise. It has become one of the most popular destination for recreation because it's the most happening and wanted place for community gatherings. Not only with the way of that it allows you to have huge people moving in, but the artistic expressions are also which foster a sense of place and social interaction, something which was missed during the course of the Radiant City concept of development. Concluding it with a global example, we have to understand with one of the very uncommon examples. We are talking of Curitiba, which is towards Brazil, and it is one of the best model of sustainable urban planning. Now, we commonly have been recognizing cities like London, Paris, Zurich, Oslo. We have actually not gone much into those which have worked a lot, but they may not be having your area of attention so huge as these already developed cities have been taking a chance. The first thing is it has an integrated transportation system. This is one of the best part, and this word bus rapid transit, BRT, is the word given by them. This has reduced the traffic congestion and improved quite highly on the air quality. Taking care of that, they have equally managed themselves with green spaces. It has very highly prioritized green spaces like what Hyderabad is also doing in India now, and it has always bagged that crown. So with that extensive parks, tree-lined streets, you will see that they have almost come up with an equalized sustainable forest with the urban forest. So that means this is the point where we have actually worked up with the most basic demand of the urban ancient development, a equating condition which we talked on our third number slide, that we have to equate what is being taken in, the same has to be reversed back. Social equity has been very strongly dealt. This effort of urban planning has primarily focused on ensuring access to public services and opportunities for all the residents. Now, this is a very important point, because when we are into a social development at a city level, what is being developed, if it is availed equally by all the residents, that is the perfect example, which is why your Curitiba, Brazil has become an international model for sustainable and equitable urban planning, and it has inspired a lot of cities around the world to adopt the similar approach. I hope you enjoyed the summary of the urban development from the ancient to the modern context. See you soon in the next lecture. Don't forget to subscribe.